Amelia Veratis spent the first gray hour after dawn methodically destroying her own plan. Because the only way to beat a man who had already read it was to make sure there was nothing left of it to read. She sat on the floor of the excellent room with the copied ledgers and the diagram of 5 seats spread around her, and she went through each move she had made in Astra, Rencala, the Audit Gallery, Tavin Aldenmere, and she assumed coldly that every one of them was compromised. Not blown, worse than blown, anticipated. A plan a hostile reader has seen is not merely useless. It is a weapon turned around, because the reader can now predict your next 3 moves from your last 3 and lead you by them like a horse. So Amelia did the thing that hurt, the thing 4 years of patient work rebelled against. She let the plan go. All of it. The turned seats, the clever leverage, the careful architecture of a vote denied by 3 families quietly warned in advance. The brother, she made herself think the word now, brother, though not the name she still would not spend, had taught her the architecture. They had learned it together in the same rooms from the same tutors before he went over the wall. He knew how Amelia Veratis built a hand, quietly, bilaterally, everything arranged before the table so that the table only ratified a decision already made in corridors. That was the family method. That was the consortium's own method. The overview she had read 100 times said it plainly. The votes that go to the table pre-negotiated are routine. The votes that arrive unresolved are the significant ones and the rare ones. Her brother would expect her to pre-negotiate. He would have taught the party who hired him to watch the corridors. So she would not fight in the corridors. She would do the one thing a Veratis was never supposed to do, the thing her own training screamed against, the thing her brother, who knew her training as his own, would never predict, because he had been taught by the same people never to do it either. She would take the fight to the open table. Unresolved. In front of all 5 families at once, with nothing arranged, and win it in the room. You taught me to arrange the vote before the room, Amelia said softly, to the grey window, to the brother who was not there, and was somehow everywhere in this city. So I'm going to lose the arrangement on purpose, and beat you in the room instead. Let's see if you still know me. The plan she built in 4 days was not a plan of leverage. It was a plan of daylight, and it started with making herself, for the first time in her career, visible. The Dracian grain proposal was going to the session as a routine distribution matter. Standard terms, generous credit, a list of dependent coastal cities to be supplied, Vaca among them. Routine matters passed on a nod, because no one made them anything else. Amelia's whole new hand rested on a single principle she had spent the 4 days confirming through the bank's own public procedure. Any party named in a distribution schedule had the standing to send a voice to the session to speak to the terms that concerned it. It was a courtesy clause, ancient, almost never used, because almost no one wanted to stand up in Astra and be noticed. Amelia wanted to be noticed. Being noticed was the whole plan. She sent to Vaca by the fast Veratis packet, and had Khan do the one thing that could not be preempted, because it was entirely legitimate and entirely public. She had Vaca itself request a seat at the session, not as a supplicant, but as a named party to a contract, entitled to hear the terms explained and to ask questions in the open. A city speaking for itself. Not the Veratis family maneuvering. The Veratis family had no standing at a consortium table, and everyone would discount anything it did. A free city, one of the coastal dependents the whole proposal was built to quietly capture, standing up in the session's house to ask, out loud in front of all 5 families, what exactly are we agreeing to, and what happens in the 3rd winter? You understand what you're doing, Khan's reply read, carried back on the packet. You're spending the family's invisibility. After this, the consortium knows Veratis intelligence sees the grain play whole. We lose the advantage of them not knowing we know. Yes, Amelia wrote back. We spend it. It's already spent, my brother saw to that. The only question left is whether we spend it for nothing in a corridor or for Vaca's independence in the open. I'd rather buy something with it. Send the voice. Send someone plain and honest and hard to rattle. Send a granary master, not a diplomat. I want the table looking at exactly what it's deciding to own. The rest of the 4 days she spent making a granary master into a weapon, which meant, mostly, refusing to make her into anything at all. Hesamar came on the fast packet 2 days later. A broad, weather-dark woman of 60 with gray hair scraped back under a plain cap, hands scarred from 40 years of grain sacks and rope, in a good brown coat that was the best thing she owned and looked it. She sat across from Amelia in the Veratis factory house and listened to what was being asked of her with a stillness that Amelia recognized, because it was the same stillness Khan had, the stillness of people who did not waste words because they had spent their lives measuring things that mattered. "You want me to stand up in front of the 5 families," Hesamar said slowly, "and ask questions?" "2 questions," Amelia said. "That's all. And here's the part you won't like, so I'll say it plainly, because you're a plain woman and I respect that. I do not want you to be clever. Clever is the one thing that loses this. Every person at that table is the cleverest in the world at what they do, and if you try to fence with them you'll lose and they'll enjoy it. Your whole power in that room, Hessa, is that you are exactly what you look like, an honest woman who keeps a city's grain and is worried about feeding it. They can out-argue a diplomat. They cannot out-argue a true question asked by someone with no angle. Because the moment they lie to you, they're lying to each other in the open, and the open is the one place their arrangements can't live. And if I'm frightened up there," Hesamar said, "I've never seen a Lord Governor, I stack grain." "Be frightened," Amelia said. "Let them see it. A frightened granary master asking whether her city will eat is worth more than any confidence I could teach you. The fear is true, Hessa. 40,000 people is a true thing to be frightened for. Bring it into the room, it's the strongest thing you'll carry." She slid a single page across the table, not a script, 2 questions in plain words. "Ask these. Look at the grain lord when you ask them, not at me, never at me. And whatever happens after, you'll have done your whole part the moment the second question leaves your mouth. The rest is 5 families and their own arithmetic." Hesamar read the 2 questions, and read them again, and something in her weathered face settled, because she understood them. They were her own questions, the ones any honest grainkeeper would ask, only no one had ever been allowed to ask them out loud. "These are just true," she said, a little wondering. "That's the whole weapon," said Amelia. "I spent 4 years and a great deal of cleverness to arrive at 2 true questions asked in daylight. Keep them plain. Plain is what they can't answer." The Sessions House of Astra was a single great room built to make 5 families feel equal. And Amelia, admitted to the gallery as a family observer, sat in the copper-threaded blacks and watched the most powerful people in the surviving world take their seats at a round table of dark wood that had no head. She read them the way she read everything. Cassindracian, Lord Governor of Orvath, mid-50s, grey and heavy and cert, the grain in his voice before he spoke a word. The man whose failing eastern fields were the whole hidden engine of the day, and who did not yet know that anyone else knew. Marco de Sangrava, 32 and beautiful and slightly wrong around the eyes, present because the compact required a family head for a credit vote, with Ren Caller at his shoulder doing the actual governing behind a courtier's smile. The Valdric seat, watchful and armed-looking even in fine clothes. The Salvar seat, salt money and silence. The Aldenmere head, and 3 chairs down from him, in the junior places, a soft, worried cousin named Tavin who caught Amelia's eye across the room for half a second and looked quickly away, remembering, she hoped, a kindness. And in the petitioner's place, alone, plain and magnificently out of his depth, stood Vaca's voice. A broad, weather-dark woman of 60 named Hesamar, granary master of the Vaca stores for 30 years in her good coat, holding her cap in 2 scarred hands, exactly as Amelia had asked. A granary master, not a diplomat. The table looked at her and saw a small city's small official and relaxed, which was the first thing Amelia had wanted. The proposal was read. Standard terms. Generous credit, a list of cities. It would have passed on a nod in 90 seconds. And in the last moment before the administrator gave Vaca the floor, Amelia felt the cold doubt she had been holding off for 4 days rise up and put its hand on her throat. What if he had predicted this too? Her brother knew her method, but he knew her mind better than her method, and a mind that abandons its method under pressure is still that mind. What if the open play, the granary master, the daylight, was exactly the desperate move he'd expect a cornered Amelia to reach for? And there was already a counter seated at that table, some quiet arrangement made in a corridor she disdained to enter. For one long breath she sat in the gallery and did not know, and could not know, and had to let the play go forward blind, which was the true cost of burning her own method. She had traded the comfort of a plan she controlled for a move she could not take back. She made herself breathe. She had chosen daylight precisely because it could not be secretly countered. A thing done in front of all 5 families is a thing no corridor can undo. If he'd beaten her here, he'd beaten her in the open, where at least she would see it. She unclenched her hands. The petitioner may speak to the terms that concern her city, the administrator said, in his neutral gray voice. Because the rules were the rules and Vaca had asked correctly and publicly, and there was no way to refuse without the refusal itself becoming the story. Hesamar spoke, and she was perfect, because she was exactly what she appeared to be. "I'm not a clever woman," she said, and her voice filled the room the way plain voices do among trained ones. "I keep the grain in Vaca 30 years, so I've only got plain questions, and I'd be grateful for plain answers because 40,000 people eat out of what I understand about this paper." She looked at Cassin Dracian because Amelia had told her to look at the grain, always at the grain. "The terms are cheap, Lord Governor, cheaper than we grow it ourselves. My first plain question is, why? Nobody sells bread under cost for kindness. What does Dracian get, in the 3rd winter, for 2 winters of cheap grain?" It was the question the whole table had agreed, in the way tables agree without speaking, not to ask. And a granary master had asked it, in the open, and now it sat in the middle of the round table, where 5 families had to look at it. "The terms reflect surplus," Cassin Dracian said, easily, because he was good. "A strong eastern harvest, more grain than the eastern markets require, distributed westward at advantageous rates. There's no mystery in a good year, granary master. There's only grain that wants moving." "That's my second plain question," said Hesamar. "The strong eastern harvest, because I trade grain, Lord Governor, and grain talks. My factors hear things off the eastern docks. They hear the expansion cities are losing fields, 3 years of losing fields, to the dead, not to weather. They hear the eastern granaries are shorter than the reports say. So my second plain question is just, is the harvest that's meant to feed my city for cheap actually in the ground? Or am I being offered grain that only grows on this paper?" The room's temperature changed. Amelia felt it from the gallery, the specific stillness of powerful people recalculating in unison. Because a granary master had just said, out loud, in front of all 5 families, the exact thing the Dracian seat had spent 2 audit narrowings burying, and now every seat at that table had to decide, in public, whether to pretend they hadn't heard it. And here was the thing Amelia had built the whole open play to produce, the thing that no corridor bargain could have achieved. She had not turned the families against Dracian. She had made Dracian's secret expensive for each of them to ignore, in front of the others, in a way each had to resolve alone. She watched it move around the table exactly as her diagram had drawn it, 4 days ago, on the floor of a room in the dark. Rencala leaned to Marco de Sangrava's ear, and Amelia knew what he was saying, because she had handed him the true thing on a terrace 6 nights before, and let him verify it himself. And now the de Sangrava seat knew it was being asked to extend credit against a harvest that was failing. A spymaster who has checked a thing does not lend good money into a hole. The de Sangrava seat, Rencala said aloud, mildly into the changed room, would find it useful to see the Eastern Harvest Field reports before it commits credit. As a matter of ordinary diligence. Given the granary master's diligence, it seems the least the table can match. It was beautifully done, not an accusation, a request for paper. And it was fatal, because the field reports were exactly what 2 audit narrowings had been built to keep off the table. And now, a second family had asked for them in the open, and refusing would be its own confession. The Valdric seat spoke next, and Amelia had not turned Valdric, and did not need to, because Valdric turned itself the moment the ground shifted. Valdric sold arms to the eastern expansion city's garrisons. Valdric's own quiet interest was in the East staying stable enough to keep buying arms, and a grain play that let the East's food crisis be papered over and exported west did not serve Valdric. A clear-eyed accounting of the Eastern collapse did. Valdric shares the concern, the seat said flat. If the Eastern fields are failing, the whole table needs the true figure, grain and garrison both. We can't price anything east on a harvest that isn't real. 2 families, then 3, aligned not by Amelia's leverage, but by their own divergent interests, all pointing at the same buried paper. And the Aldenmere seat, which could have carried the proposal through on a block with Dracian and Salt Money Salvar. The Aldenmere head glanced once at his worried cousin Tavin in the junior chairs. And Tavin, who had been fed by his family's own quiet briefing to expect a routine yes, gave the smallest uncertain shake of his head, because a Veratis woman had been decent to him once, and it had made him, for 4 days, wonder what he owed and to whom. And a man who is wondering does not whip his family into a block. The Aldenmere seat abstained. It was the smallest possible act. It was enough. It appears, the administrator said in his neutral voice, reading the room the way he read everything, that the proposal is not ready for a vote. 3 seats have asked for the Eastern field reports before committing. The compact requires those reports be produced to the collective audit regardless. I suggest the grain distribution be held over pending the audit's completion. He paused, precisely. Unless the Dracian seat wishes to press the vote today as it stands. Cassin Dracian looked around a table that would, if he pressed, force his failing harvest into the light in front of the 4 families he most needed never to see it. And did the only thing a cornered grain lord could do. Dracian withdraws the distribution schedule for revision, he said, evenly, hating it, pending the audit. There's no urgency in a good year. And the proposal that would have owned Vacher in 3 winters died, not by a vote against it, but by never being allowed to become a vote at all. Held over into an audit it could not survive, killed by a granary master's plain questions, and the private arithmetic of 5 families who each, for their own reasons, could not afford to let it pass in the open. Hesamar stood in the petitioner's place holding her cap, not entirely sure what had just happened, only that her city was not going to be made to eat someone else's bread. Amelia Veratis sat in the gallery in her blacks, warm and precise and outwardly still, and let herself feel, for exactly 1 breath, the specific joy of a hand won in the open. The cost came due that evening, as costs in Astra always did, quietly, over tea no one drank. She had spent the family's invisibility. That was real and it was permanent. The consortium now knew that Veratis intelligence had seen the grain play whole, and had the reach to break it at the table, which meant every future Veratis move would be watched harder, guarded against sooner, priced higher. She had traded a strategic secret for a tactical win. Khan would enter it in the family's ledger as a loss and a victory on the same line, and both would be true. But that was not the cost that sat with her, alone, at the window of the excellent room, watching the perfect city put out its perfect lamps. The cost that sat with her was the folder. Someone had shown her the trap in advance. Someone had reached into the most controlled city in the world, compiled her every move, and handed it back not to beat her but to be recognized. And she had won anyway, by burning the very method he'd counted on, which meant that somewhere tonight her brother knew she had understood his message and refused it. The channel was open. It had been open, perhaps, for years. The 2 consortium plays her intelligence had touched and never seen whole, she understood now, were exactly the 2 a brother who knew her methods could have hidden from her. He had been there, in the gaps in her own work, the whole time. And he had chosen, this once, to let her see him. She did not know why. That was the part she could not close, sitting in the dark, to warn her, to taunt her, to ask, in the only language they still shared, whether she would come and find him. Every reading led somewhere different, and every somewhere was a season's worth of work she could not do tonight, in Astra, with a packet to catch, and a city to leave before it decided its courtesy had run out. So she did what her whole life had trained her to do with a thread she could not yet pull. She filed it. Coldly, without acting, with the understanding that the filing was itself a kind of action. Somewhere out there was a brother who had gone over the wall and made himself into the one blind spot in the best intelligence network in the surviving world, and who had this week reached out and touched her hand across the board to prove he still could. That was not a thing to be solved in a night. It was a thing to be survived, and remembered, and returned to, when she had built the strength to return to it. Not yet, Amelia said to the dark, to the city, to the brother she had refused to name for 4 days. I know you're there, I know what you did, and I'm not coming yet. The window gave her back only her own reflection, warm and precise and alone. But I know the door isn't closed, you made sure I'd know. So did I once, we were always the same that way. She left Astra on the morning tide with Hessa Mar. The two of them at the coaster's rail watching the proof city shrink against the silver sea. And the granary master, who was nobody's fool, finally asked the question she'd been holding since the session. I stood up in that room and asked 2 plain questions, Hessa Mar said, and 5 families the size of the world folded a grain deal over them. Plain questions don't do that, Madame Veratis. So what did I actually do in there? You asked the questions everyone at that table already knew the answers to and had agreed not to say, Amelia said. That's all. That's the whole trick, and it isn't a trick. Powerful people build their arrangements in corridors, quietly, so the arrangements never have to survive daylight, because most of them can't. You brought daylight. You made 5 families look at a thing in front of each other that they could each only afford to ignore in private. You didn't beat them, Hessa. You just made them beat each other, by making the truth cost more to hide than to admit. And Vodka's safe. Vodka's safe this winter and next, Amelia said, and gave her the honest answer because Hessa Mar had earned it and because false comfort was its own kind of contempt. The grain plays dead, but the reason for it isn't the East is still failing, Dracian still grows the world's bread, and the day they solve their Eastern problem, they'll want a market for the surplus again, and vodka will look cheap and hungry all over again. This wasn't a war one. It was a winter bought. That's what my work mostly is, Hessa, buying winters. You keep grain against the hard season. I keep independence the same way. Neither of us gets to win the weather. We just make sure the city eats through 1 more year of it. Hessa Mar thought about that in the plain way she thought about everything, and nodded, and looked back at the shrinking city. Then I'll take the winter, she said. 40,000 people don't need forever. They need this year. You get us this year, Madame Veratis, and I'll thank you for it in bread every autumn you live. Amelia Veratis stood at the rail in her working greys, the copper-threaded blacks folded away in her chest below, the twin crescent blades she had not needed wrapped in oilcloth beneath them, and let the cold, clean sea wind take the last of Astra off her. She had gone into the enemy's perfect city to save her own, and had found her plan already read by a ghost she had spent years pretending was buried, and had won anyway in the open, with a granary master and 2 plain questions, by becoming for 1 week a woman even her own brother could not predict. It had cost the family a secret, and cost her a wound reopened that would not close again for a long time. But vodka would eat its own bread this winter and the next, out of its own granaries, on its own terms. 40,000 people would go to sleep in a free city, and never know how close they had come to waking in an owned one. Or that a woman in copper-threaded black had stood in a gallery in Astra, and bought them the years. Or that somewhere beyond the silver horizon a brother she loved, and could not trust had watched her do it, and let her, and gone quiet again, into the gap in the world's best eyes that only he knew how to occupy. That was the work, buying winters, filing the threads you couldn't pull, going home with less than you came with and a city still standing behind you. Amelia turned her face into the wind toward Vodka, and the Lake District beyond it, and the long game that had no end and no winning, only the next hard season, and the one after that, held off one plain true question at a time.